Welcome to the second session on impact measurement. For those of you that were a part of the conversation this morning, it was a riveting conversation filled with really great questions and some really amazing insights from the panelists. The morning session really focused on trying to recap why we're measuring and who for, and sort of delved into a little bit of the topics of how they do it and what are the processes around that. This session, we're hoping to dive in much deeper and get into sort of the lessons and the nitty-gritty and the realities of what it means to be someone that actually delivers on impact measurement and what that means and what the future of that should look like. So I am just going to introduce Veronica, who will be our esteemed moderator for this afternoon session, and then we'll let her take it from there. So Veronica is the Director of Measurement, Evaluation, and Organizational Performance at the Rockefeller Foundation and has many years of experience in with managing this topic and getting into the weeds of the details. And so I will hand it over to you, Veronica, and take us away.
Sure. Did you want to take a little bit of a poll of who's in the room?
Sure. So just to get a sense of who all is in the room, can we see a show of hands of individual investors who are investing on behalf of themselves? Those that are asset managers, managing third-party capital, advisors, consultants, people that are just curious. That's what I asked this morning. And then is there anyone in the room that has not done an actual impact investment or had exposure to one? And that's okay. That's good.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
That's what we want, actually.
Yeah,
we want
yeah.
more of you.
And see a show of hands of people who are skeptical of the term impact measurement. Yeah.
Great. So
Okay.
This is a livelier room than this morning. This morning there was like no hands, and it was much fuller. It was quite intimidating, I think, for those panelists out there. As mentioned, my name is Veronica Lazabal. The Rockefeller Foundation, maybe you know, maybe you don't know, has been around for about 105 years. About a decade ago, we helped formalize and sort of this space by coining the term impact investing. We also kicked off that whole sort of portfolio work at the foundation about a decade ago with institutionalizing a couple of interesting organizations. Maybe you've heard about them. The GIN, for example, we tested out and promoted some of the work in terms of measurement standards around like years and iris, and we can get into whether or not those terms actually have names now. If you're in the iris space and you ask the GIN today, they will tell you that iris no longer actually stands for anything. It's just called iris. So anyway, so we have been, why we care about this space is we've been in it for a while. And it's interesting, from the impact measurement and evaluation space, I've started a couple of years ago, I started taking stock of where we were. Where we were with, the evidence that we could actually drive social and financial performance at the same time, where we were with this question around standards, and where we were with just our overall philosophy around measurement. And happily, I'm here and joined today by many people who have also been asking themselves these questions. So the way that this session was going to differentiate from the earlier session is that it was going to be much more sort of practitioner oriented in terms of the how, but really I think that what we learned from this morning's session is that it sort of toggled between the why and the how and the what, and so we might be toggling in that way as well. So if you want to sort of learn something more specific, please don't be shy about asking on the one hand. And on the other hand, if you are sort of hearing something that is not clear, don't be shy about asking. So I'm going to start off with, before we introduce the panelists, I'm going to start off by asking whether there are any burning questions out there, anything that you really came to this session for. And please do be explicit because we want to make sure that we meet your expectations. Okay, there's a question over there behind you.
Hi, my name is Natalie, and my question is more macro. So how do you balance between like a standardized impact measurement and a bespoke one? Because I think that's a very important question for all the nonprofits or the sector in general.
Great question. Great. Next, I think you had a question.
Is it better to have relative scoring, or is it better to have more absolute?
Okay, great. Anyone else?
With the mainstreaming of impact, there are a lot of traditional financial players, particularly in the private space, who come into impact investing, and they are using their own. So I guess it goes back to the bespoke. How is that changing the impact space? Mainstreaming, how is that affecting the standardization that was born in impact?
Great. And when you say traditional, what do you actually, could you just talk a little about what you mean by traditional? Just
Finance only.
Got it. Okay. Okay, so we're going to come back to some of these questions at the end, but for the panelists, just to have some of them in the back of your mind as you're speaking. So we're going to kick off, and we're going to do so by, I'm going to ask all of our panelists to introduce themselves. I'm not going to introduce them for you. And then we're going to kick off into very specific questions that we've sort of planned out. And then we're going to turn it to you. We're going to take a little bit of a round robin, sort of rapid poll around 3 questions. We'll come back, we'll circle back to him, and then we'll sort of circle back to you. So we really want this to be more of a chat. Someone actually said to me, this is supposed to be a chat, and not us lecturing you. We are all learning in this space, and we've done a lot of learning. And really, if we were to sort of do like the big headline around what we would like to offer you today is sort of compelling you with the story of how we've moved from a metric to a process. So keep that in the back of your minds as you're thinking. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne Amanda so that she can introduce herself.
I'm Anne Amanda. I'm not Anne or Amanda because I'm difficult. I work for a family office called Treehouse Investments. And we invest across asset classes. We're long-term investors. I had to have notes because I'm nervous. And we target investments that contribute to 3 issues: reversing climate change, gender equality, and achieving scale. And in general, most of those have been in the energy space. So we try to find ways of working all 3 of those into our mostly energy-related investments.
Priya?
Hi, I'm Priya Parrish. I'm with Impact Engine in Chicago. We manage both early-stage venture capital funds focused on software companies, seed and Series A, and also private equity impact investing, which is actually focused on catalyzing the creation of the much-needed growth equity and buyout impact funds that are not mega GPs, but actual firms with impact in their DNA. My background is, before this, I was at a family office investing across asset classes. Have also been involved in the seeding business and emerging managers for a long time, and started my career in the ESG and SRI space in public markets, and also an angel investor in social ventures since about 2005.
Tom?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Welfel. I'm with Pacific Community Ventures. We're a community development finance institution, or CDFI for short, based in Oakland, California. We have a small business loan fund that's focused on supporting the creation of quality jobs in underserved markets within California. Now, within the CDFI, within our organization PCV, I'm actually part of our research and consulting practice. And so what we do with our research and consulting practice is really try to support the growth and efficacy of the impact investing market. So we work with a range of institutions, from pension funds to insurers to fellow CDFIs, fund managers, really people across the capital chain. And we focus on 3 primary areas in our research and consulting practice. One being impact measurement management, hence why I'm speaking to you on this panel today. Also around strategy consulting, and then other research projects that are intended to kind of share best practice or focus in on an issue of concern or importance within the impact investing market. So we've done a lot of research recently on the importance of getting folks in the U.S. to look more closely at the underlying quality of jobs that are being created through impact investments, and have developed some tools and resources around that. But today I'll share more with you on kind of what we're doing on the consulting side related to impact measurement management.
Thanks, Tom. And Olivia, and maybe if you could do a little bit of a double click on the IMP.
I can do that. Thank you, Veronica. My name is Olivia Prentice. I'm with the Impact Management Project, or the IMP, because that's a mouthful. Can I see by a raise of hands who has heard of the Impact Management Project? About half and half? Okay, that's great. So those of you who have heard of it, forgive me. I'm just going to give a brief explanation. So the Impact Management Project was started 2 years ago. It's a market-building effort, grant-funded, and it actually was born out of the confusion in the investing space around impact measurement. I previously, in my former life, was a impact person in a fund manager, and we were doing impact measurement. And yet we weren't kind of getting to the answers. We weren't actually sure if we were doing any good impact. And so what the project was trying to do was to say, well, hang on a minute, maybe we've got this narrative wrong. Is it not about impact measurement, but impact management? Do we need to know what good looks like first? Do we need to set our goals? And what does that mean? And actually, can we agree between different tribes what that means? So not only the impact investing community, the ESG community, the foundation community, the responsible investment community, the enterprises themselves, the high net worths. And so what the project has tried to do is bring together over 2,000 stakeholders to date from all different paths to try and have this conversation and agree some norms for impact management. This was 2 years ago. We've now created the basis of what I think could be called a standard. And we have now created a network out of this, which was just launched 2 weeks ago, in an effort to actually align all of the tools, some of which you see there, and ratings and other market infrastructure with this standard. So I can talk a little bit more about that sort of bespoke framework question that came up quite a lot. But
Great, thanks so much. So as you can see, there's a whole bunch of expertise on the panel, but there's also different representatives from different places in the ecosystem, and I think that that is actually important. Something that came up earlier in the conversation was today was a bit about sort of there being a spectrum of different decision makers and sort of for whom do we do impact measurement and management. And so keeping that in the back of the minds, I'm going to start off with asking Anne Amanda. First question. So could you speak, you talked a little bit about Treehouse's sort of approach to impact measurement and management, but could you talk a little bit more about sort of your current philosophy as well as how it may have evolved over the years?
Absolutely. Can you guys hear me okay? So we started out wanting to be an impact investment house because what we were getting, the products that we were getting in the private client sections of the banks were so disappointing. We found this was before 2013. We set up the business in 2013. In 2007, we set up a family business called Aspinall Energies to develop renewable energy projects, to develop, own, and operate renewable energy projects because we care deeply about climate change and we're terrified at the way things are going. And sadly, that terror has not got less with the years. But what we found is that it was slower to invest the family's capital through infrastructure than we expected. And the opportunities for managing that capital in the meantime were very disappointing and often diametrically, actively opposed to the ultimate goals that we wanted of fighting climate change. So we set up Treehouse in 2013 to really demonstrate that we could do what we wanted to do, which is have a positive impact explicitly on climate and also on women in a way that would respond to that fiduciary duty that we had to the family and would maintain and grow the capital that we were putting into and show the banks that they were mistaken in the premise that they put forward to us, which is that you can't have both. So for us, it's fundamentally critical to measure, because if we don't measure, then we're not proving anything. We're having a nice time with our money, and that's great, but that doesn't change anything. Fundamentally for us, being a catalyst in this movement that we see and that we want to see more of, which is why it's so exciting to have people involved who are new to it, and that it's not a special club of rich people who get to spend their money in nice things while the rest of you poor suckers are out there getting whatever, It's that we all have to seriously change the financial institution that we're working with now, that it's not sustainable, and it needs to become sustainable. And that wasn't very targeted, but that's the picture.
We're good. Good. So just flipping it to Tom, I think it's important to sort of understand where people are in different places in the ecosystem are coming from. But could you talk a little bit about what your current sort of philosophy approach is, as well as any specific tools that you're using to be able to sort of align with your philosophy and approach to impact measurement and management?
Sure. So first, I guess, just to kind of set some context about PCV as a CDFI and the work we're doing in terms of consulting to other institutions around impact measurement. So when PCV was founded 20 years ago, our co-founders really had a strong commitment to the practice of impact measurement and management. It was something, frankly, built into the organization's DNA from the day it was founded. In the early years, I think it was up to a third of our operating budget was allocated to impact measurement and reporting. And so really it was through this commitment to impact measurement and management early on and the reporting work that we were doing to some of our early LPs that our consulting practice was born. One of the LPs, CalPERS, had been receiving our investor reports and asked us to replicate this for $1 billion economically targeted investment they were making in California, known as the California Initiative Private Equity. So really, we didn't set up to start a research and consulting practice out of a CDFI nonprofit, but that's just kind of what happened organically. And we realized we had this capacity that we could offer and really help others. So I would say from day one, impact measurement management has been a priority for PCV in terms of wanting to understand our own impact and then seeing how we could share that capacity with others and really develop the practice of others to be able to better understand their own impact. And what I would say in terms of what we've seen in the last couple years related to this discussion around impact measurement is frankly a fundamental shift. Before we just see the term impact measurement used, now we're hearing the terms impact management used increasingly. So I think we've shifted from a place where impact measurement was focused on reporting out to stakeholders to now utilizing this information and data to really inform decision making and ensure that we're learning from what the non-financial data is saying about our investments. So I think that's been an important shift. And even within the last 2-3 years, thanks to the efforts of the Impact Management Project, the GIN's IRIS team, even I'd say the Rockefeller's efforts to bring the evaluation community into closer contact with impact investors, we've seen the bar being raised in terms of the level of rigor and just the standard of practice when it comes to impact measurement. And that's really across all of the client work that we're doing. We're seeing more clients demanding more rigorous, more robust impact measurement management systems, really wanting to build their own capacity to do this more effectively, whereas before oftentimes there was a conversation around, well, could you just do this for us? Can we outsource this to you? So increasingly more and more impact investors are seeing the practice of impact measurement management as really integral or central to their investment process around impact investing. So I think that's been an important shift, and a lot of the field building efforts are pushing us in that direction. In terms of tools and processes that we've been utilizing at PCV and actually utilizing with clients, one piece we've been focusing on at PCV is trying to bring more rigor to the due diligence conversation around the loans that we're making in California's underserved communities, really wanting to better understand the potential to be supporting the creation of quality jobs. So what we've actually done is developed a quantitative impact due diligence tool that really takes a lot of the information and data we were already getting during the due diligence underwriting process and puts that into a kind of a scoring system that tells us to what extent we believe we'll be able to support quality job creation with that particular loan. And what we're able to do with having data on each of the loans we're underwriting is actually see how that compares against the entire portfolio, and we can have a robust discussion around risk, return, and impact in terms of thinking about how that particular loan fits within the portfolio. So that's something we've been doing with our own loans at PCV. We've actually developed these tools for other clients within the impact investing space. And what we're wanting to do now, what we're focusing on right now, is doing some research around best practices in impact due diligence, thanks to the support of people like the Impact Management Project, as well as some research support for the GIN. And so early next year, we'll be releasing some findings that really point to what is best practice for how you would go about conducting rigorous impact due diligence. We're really wanting to help people pay closer attention to impact before they're deploying capital rather than after. So we see that as a huge opportunity.
Thanks so much. So I know that Olivia had asked who had heard of the Impact Management Project, but I wanted to get a sense of who has used the impact management sort of framework or norms or conventions or any of the above. Could you raise your hand just so that we have a sense of that? Okay, great. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Olivia to talk a little bit about sort of, number one, why she thinks the IMP, that's the acronym, has seen so much traction over the last years, where they are in their journey, and just generally speaking, from a management point of view, what does the IMP bring to the conversation around, the questions around the one metric and the benchmarks and the standardization piece?
A lot in that question.
Yes, but you can do it. You can do it.
Okay. So I think, as I mentioned, when we started to have this conversation about what is impact management and got all of these different groups together, I think where we had to start was, what do we mean by impact? And this isn't what do we mean by impact investing. This is just to say, what information do we actually need to understand the experience of people and planet? And so we started by just asking people like you and me kind of, okay, but how would you describe when you experience an effect from buying a product or service? And that was really interesting because that's what helped us uncover the 5 dimensions. So in answer to your question, why has it resonated with people? I think these 5 dimensions of impact, which is kind of what outcome, for who, how much, what contribution to what would have otherwise happened, and impact risk, which is a likelihood of the impact happening. It's not the likelihood of negative effects. I just wanted to clarify that. Those 5 dimensions have been really clarifying on lots of different levels. For an enterprise, it helps them figure out what impact they need to manage. There's been a lot of research done about kind of stakeholder assessments, materiality. None of this is new. It's just a new way of thinking about how you can actually understand each individual effect. And because this is important because to date, those effects have been taken out of context of the other dimensions. So you might see a kind of a common metric of number of jobs created. Now that doesn't have all the dimensions in it. That doesn't have who the jobs were for. Were they previously unemployed people? Or was it me who just came from another job? Now, then if you're comparing impact to impact and you haven't got all those dimensions, you're not going to be comparing apples to apples, and then you can't even start to have that benchmarking conversation. And so that became really important for people, not only because it helps that measurement conversation. You can literally go down in any impact report and find that what, find the scale and the depth and the how much, find that who. And actually, interestingly, what you can also do is say, well, actually, this is all kind of linked together in a kind of confusing way. Let's just get the raw data. Let's just make this a little bit simpler for everybody so we can start looking across. So that's important. But actually, even before you get to the collecting data point, it helps us communicate what we're trying to do. And for the asset owners in the room and the asset managers, that's been a massive blocker to investment. This is what we heard when we had these sort of consultative calls to try and find some norms, it was really hard for a high net worth to be able to express what kind of impact they wanted to have. And then for the poor advisors to match that to product, when all the products were saying, I'm an ethical XYZ product, or I'm a sustainable X product, I'm a responsible, I'm an impact, but this is what I mean by impact. That's not going to work. We can't start figuring out which investments or which approaches are best at tackling the SDGs or any other problem if we can't start to compare our approaches with each other or even describe what we're doing. And so I think what really resonated with the Impact Management Project was that we started to be able to, for the first time, categorize the different types of investment. So there's this matrix which helps you say, well, this is the impact of the underlying enterprises that can be described in a common way across the 5 dimensions. And then here I'm going to add on the contribution that the investor makes to that impact. And let's keep those 2 things separate because actually they are very different things and they often get conflated in quite a confusing way. And actually if you take those things and if you categorize them, you can find trends. You can find that there's types of dimension, types of performance against dimensions for one type of impact, avoiding harm. You can kind of see patterns where you're trying to reduce significant effects on negative outcomes. That's quite straightforward. You can kind of see that in the dimensions. And that gets you to a point where actually you can start to match intentions with impact for the first time. And then eventually down the line, what we're hoping to be able to do, and this is in partnership with the World Benchmarking Alliance, they're taking some of the largest corporates to start actually trying to benchmark impact performance. And that hasn't been done before. So that's quite exciting. I kind of wanted to just really quickly, if I have time, pick up on this measurement point because I often harp on about impact management for obvious reasons, but that's not to suggest that impact measurement is at the heart of all of this. So I wanted to just try and explain this framework versus tool thing the way I see it, because I actually hate the word tool and I don't quite know what it means. So I was just going to sort of say, if this helps, I mentioned each dimension, that's really sort of high level, but let's just take the who, for example, so who's affected by a product or service. There are lots of different measurement techniques or tools you can use to measure the who. You can use Acumen's lean data approach. You can use the poverty probability index. You can get your customers to kind of tick a box to say that they're female. There are lots of different approaches and tools you can use to measure one dimension. But crucially, when you're constructing an impact framework as an enterprise or as an investor, that's about prioritizing which dimensions matter to you and about setting thresholds for what good looks like to you. And then to Tom's point about the diligence framework, that's important because it helps you relatively mark whether you're reaching the impact you thought you were going to do. That's all very well, but until we all make transparent what good looks like for us, we can't benchmark. So I guess my key message would be being transparent about what tools we've used to measure each dimension, say what we think good looks like. And sometimes it's really easy. We have living wage foundations which tell us what good employment thresholds look like. But in a lot of other sectors, it's quite difficult. So trying to say what we think a sustainable livelihood looks like for a farmer, perhaps, so that we can be really transparent, and maybe then Mars and Unilever could actually compare who's got the more sustainable livelihoods, would be really, really helpful.
Great, thank you. So, it's interesting because earlier in the session, also a question that came up when we started was the sort of sense of how do we balance between the standard and the bespoke. And back in the day, when we used to want to answer that question, and I say back in the day, I mean, it could be that this is the current reality as well, there was this sense of, we will just go to the IRIS catalog of indicators, metrics, and just pull them and sort of align them and do something there. And so, I find that when I fast forward to today, I feel that there are a couple of really big changes, one of which is this understanding that impact measurement is actually a process and that needs to be managed. And so it's not a coincidence that the word that management is in the impact management project, or that we have sort of caught on to it. Number two is this sense that, once you get the data, there was a question earlier today around, where are we with the data? And that's just a very broad question because there's data for who, varying degrees of quality, in what countries, in what sectors. There's so many more double clicks you can do on the data piece. But in cases where I have seen good quality data, in the best case scenario, there's sort of this element missing around actually doing something with it, as if the data will speak for itself. And that is a cognitive trap. And I think that we've moved beyond that, but in case you might not be aware of it, the data needs to be analyzed and it needs to be in service to some kind of decision-making pipeline of some sort. And actually, that's where many organizations get stuck. And then the last piece to it, before I sort of turn over to Priya, is, in terms of what's different, there has also been lots of discussions around sort of whose framework, whose standard, whose benchmark. I think that there's an opportunity in the current global times to sort of somewhat align some of our thinking around that and answering that to the SDGs, to the Sustainable Development Goals. And that actually has allowed, this was talked about earlier in the morning session too, that's allowed us to actually sort of have a little bit of a benchmark without being overly prescriptive. And so in sort of service to contributing to your thinking around whether or not there is still this one metric goal or whether it's a process, I'm going to turn it over to Priya to talk a little bit about where Impact Engine is and what your thoughts are in terms of the one metric versus process.
Sure. So I also say that impact investing is a verb. It's not an adjective, and I think that's one clear way of guiding you in terms of whether it's a metric or process. And so for us, we started as an accelerator. We were created to help social entrepreneurs create impact and profits in a way that was reinforcing. And so I always think in terms of, you're measuring things to make better decisions. And so the first question is, for whom? Is it for policymakers? Is it for investors? Is it for the business owners? And this is a bit of my own just personal view. I think people who grew up just as an investor and have never run a business or started a business or operated a business, I think they sometimes miss the very important fact that the person that's creating the value, you want them to succeed. And so you want to create metrics and processes that help them create better impact and create more profits, and that actually is the metric that the investor should want as well. So I believe it is quite aligned. And so for that reason, our own framework has very much been built around KPIs. And we think that each business is very different in terms of what KPIs are important. Different types of impact categories or themes also have very different relevant KPIs and different industries as well. And so it's really, really hard. I think anytime you try to come up with one measurement or one metric, you basically lose all the insights and value in the data, and you don't get to better decisions. But we do think it's really important to have standardization around framework, and have been very supportive of the work coming out of the Impact Management Project, and have tried to adapt that, again, to our own view of we're here to help those businesses and business owners generate impact. And so now as we also move into being fund investors and seeding fund managers, we're trying to kind of spread that gospel as well, that think about who's actually creating that social value. And so we think, again, from a business owner's hat, where in the business model are you driving impact? And so we talk about the 5 Ps. There's product-based impact, that comes from the actual product or service that you're selling. There's place-based impact, people-based impact, process-based impact, and paradigm impact. And then you can almost create a matrix from those 5 in terms of what is the desired impact. Is it within better outcomes in health, better access to quality education, things like that. And once you start to really understand the context and the relevancy of the business within that framework, the KPIs naturally flow out of it. And so we're trying to essentially come up with KPIs that the entrepreneurs themselves want to measure and that the fund managers also want to measure because it's going to make them better. And I think one part of this that's also been really important to us and some of our peers and colleagues that actually manage impact funds is I don't think people completely appreciate just how hard it is to actually collect the data. Like, forget about coming up with the hypothesis and the thesis and the outcomes and the outputs. Good luck going and getting those outputs from those companies, which are too busy figuring out how to grow and manage, that if you're not coming up with metrics that they actually want to measure anyways, then the quality of your data is gonna be lacking, and so you're shooting yourself in the foot from the beginning. So this also very much informs our view that we want to come up with relevant, simple, but important KPIs at the company level and the fund level.
Great. Thanks. So picking up on this, it's not easy. It's actually hard, and it's quite nuanced. I would say that the space has really become much more sophisticated, but that there's ultimate tensions that have surfaced that I don't think we would have had the visibility to be able to have seen when we first started. So, and one of them is around this balancing around the simplicity piece with the authenticity component. We talked a lot about impact washing. We talked a lot earlier in today's session about, what about sort of those actors that are actually collecting impact data? Is there somehow a higher scrutiny bar for those versus those that just call themselves impact and are actually not collecting or doing anything around the impact management piece? So Tom, from where you sit, what does that tension between balancing authenticity and simplicity look like, and how do you manage around that?
Yeah, so I think there is a tension between authenticity and simplicity, or the way I like to think of it is more practicality, and frankly, it's something that we navigate in every client impact measurement management engagement. And really, I think that the way we do that is trying to kind of right-size the approach around impact measurement management to the unique context of that particular impact investor. So, the context depends on a number of different factors. It depends on the markets you're operating in. It depends on where you sit in the capital chain, whether you're an asset owner, an asset manager, or even a social enterprise, in terms of how far away you are from that impact that's happening on the ground. In some instances, too, it also depends on the type of capital you're deploying in terms of your underlying relationship with that and impact, and then the ability to collect data. So the way that we approach it is trying to be really context-specific around developing an impact measurement management system that balances rigor, practicality, or I guess authenticity with practicality. And I think the way that we've seen that work really well in practice is by creating an impact measurement management approach that's truly embedded in an existing investment process, not something that sits outside of your investment process or where you have just one team member who kind of owns that and is off kind of crunching the numbers. Because what we see is then, where it's kind of sitting separate, it doesn't necessarily produce the same kind of value for the investment team and also for investees. So where possible, I think you really want to be thoughtful about embedding various impact measurement management processes within your pre-investment processes, within your investment management processes, within even the way you're thinking about exits. And that's, I think, where you can kind of find the right balance between practicality and authenticity.
Great, thanks so much. And so what about you, Olivia? How do you see, sort of from where you sit, how do you see sort of this tension between authenticity and simplicity?
I'm going to talk about incentives on this, actually, because I think that's where they're all off whack, and that's causing some problems. Because, what Priya said is so clear-cut, and it's so obvious that as an enterprise, you collect data because you are incentivized to improve your business. And you also recognize increasingly that, therefore, environmental things, social things will affect your bottom line, so you'll probably look at them. You might also have like a social, skew on your business model, so you'll care about that as well. So I think then the problem happens because you have out of whack incentives as you go up that value chain. So to the investment manager. Now, again, if you ask them, why do you collect impact data? It should be the same reason. It should be, well, I want to support my investee to improve their impact. If they have a constraint, they can't engage actively to improve that impact. They should just say, well, I want to know what's happening. I want to know if my goals have been met. And yet that can't happen because the asset owners above them are saying, well, I want some data. Well, if you ask them why they want some data, it's probably not to say, well, I want to know if impact management's happening. I want to know if my goals are being met, because more often than not at the moment, asset owners aren't in a position where they can set clear goals because all the language is so different. They have their own constraints. They have their own ways of having to position things for the market. It's all a little bit confused. And so what I'd say is authenticity is always key. But we have to kind of have a big culture change, I think, in the investment space if we're going to reach like true and really good impact measurement and management. And that's actually no fault of the investment managers who all have the best intentions. It's because of the norm to share as much data as possible in a way that makes the investments look as good as they can. And that's a really big problem because actually these are shiny impact reports that, like, so I come from Bridges Fund Management. I've been culpable of producing a shiny impact report with big numbers and big SDGs all over it, but that doesn't tell you whether Bridges Growth Fund or Social Impact Bond Fund is any different to tree houses other than our slightly different thematic focuses. And that's a problem, right? Because we're incentivized to do the wrong things with our data. So to cut this long story short, I think authenticity has got to be key all the way up and down the value chain. But we've got to be asking ourselves different questions, which is, what are our goals? Can we be more transparent about them? And then can we ask enterprises for the data? I'm just going to echo Priya because I think that's the key message to take away. Can we just ask enterprises for the data that they collect to manage their business, and then their own judgment of what good looks like, along with an explanation of why they think that? If we can get to a point where impact reporting is more of an impact statement alongside a financial statement that's just raw data with explanations, it's not aggregated, we're not adding up like number of lives touched, because that's not going to tell us whether we've met goals, which aren't across types of people. They're by different outcomes and by different effects. So that would be my main call to action.
Veronica, if I can just add on,
Sure,
on the
of course,
goals
Tom.
point, I think that's a really important point that Olivia is making in terms of, I think authenticity is borne out through people being really clear on what their goals are, what their impact objectives are. And one of the ways that we're seeing more and more impact investors being more thoughtful about defining their goals is more people are turning to developing theories of change, logic models that clearly articulate their activities, their inputs, and how that's translating to outputs, outcomes, and ultimately impact. And that's been a useful tool for us in terms of our consulting engagements with clients, whether it be a foundation like the MacArthur Foundation, who's investing in place through the Benefit Chicago Initiative, $100 million, or even investors who are investing across a range of themes and having pretty clear goals around those various themes. So that's, I think, one thing I would encourage you all to do is think through whether a theory of change or logic model could be useful in terms of helping get more clarity around goals. And I think it's not just useful in terms of impact measurement management, but also in terms of just communicating who you are to the market as an impact investor.
Thanks, super helpful. When I reflect back on some of the pieces that you've shared, there is definitely still sort of a theoretical conversation that I'm having most of the time with many investors and asset managers and fund managers and even social enterprises because they're not collecting the data. One of our speakers earlier today, Sasha Dichter from the Acumen Fund, talked a little bit about how the nature of the conversation just changes when you have some data. That is something that I think the industry is still struggling with. But I do see some opportunities, one of which Tom talked a little bit about in terms of utilizing like theory of change and logic modeling and sort of talking about outcomes and not talking about outputs and things that and this is why I asked about the traditional piece earlier, things that the traditional development, social sector practitioners out there in the world, primarily from the public sector, multilaterals, bilaterals, et cetera, they've been tools that they've been using. I think that the one critique I would say about the way that they've been using the tools is that typically the question around what is our impact has happened after the fact. The opportunity that I think the impact investing community brings to the table is being able to embed some of these bigger questions in your due diligence, pre-due diligence phases to be able to make sure you're designing, you're sort of managing, and the goalpost is set towards a specific North Star that is impact-oriented, and then utilizing these tools. So I have to say, as someone who sort of dabbles in both worlds, Even though it's 10 years later and we're still sort of having this conversation, although it is a different conversation, it is, this has taken the sort of traditional development sector, social sector industry about 70 years to get to. So I think that that's actually optimistic. But turning it over to Ann Amanda, from the Treehouse point of view, like what are some of those areas that you're still grappling with? Are you grappling with getting data? What are the tools that you're using to sort of navigate through some of these challenges? And just could you talk a little bit about where you are with the various different approaches that you're using?
Sure. Various makes it sound very grand.
It is various.
So we have our 3 impact goals that it took us a little while to define. At first, we were just impact investing. And we knew that we cared about climate, we knew that we cared about gender, we knew that we wanted our businesses to grow. But other than that, it was pretty vague. And that wasn't that long ago. And then I would say probably 2016, we started to realize that we needed to have something a little more rigorous. We needed to understand it in a framework that could bring more, I think. And so we identified a few indicators, and they didn't explicitly come from any of the models that I know of, although I think a lot of them are covered within those models. But they are literally, greenhouse gases emitted by each investment. And what we wanted to do was, because we invest across asset classes, we wanted something that was comparable for a whole portfolio. And we wanted to get, sort of touching on your question about relative versus absolute scoring, we wanted a number at the end of the day. How many greenhouse gases were emitted or offset by our investment portfolio? How many, what percentage of our investments board members are women? What percentage of our investments C-suite are women? And then what is the IRR? And that's fundamentally how we looked at it. They're very simple numbers in theory. They're not difficult to get your head around. We've had a surprising amount of pushback early stage from either the managers or the management team on how applicable they were to the business to touch. Now, I would say that it's core to any business to have a diverse management team and to be looking at their emissions, because it has to do with efficiency, but that's not been the easiest argument with everybody. The funds are the worst, because they're like, oh, we don't measure for us. We don't measure how our emissions at all. They might measure the emissions of one of their investees if that investee is in something that has a nice system to measure their greenhouse gas, and only the positive side, never the operational side. Always like, so GOGLA is the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, and they have a system in place for measuring your greenhouse gas emissions of your off-grid solar household system. So there's something. You can give an answer for that. But then we started getting into, okay, do we count in our portfolio the greenhouse gases that are part of debt or just equity? Because we do both. So equity is kind of simple. We have X percent of the company, so we can claim X percent of their greenhouse gas emissions. But what about debt? So we said, no, we won't take debt. But we're invested in equity in some debt financing groups, and they claim. And we haven't tried. So the women's stuff is easy. But the climate stuff, which seems like it would be relatively straightforward, has in fact been a colossal headache. And basically we are still collecting the data. So 2017 was the first year where we did, across our portfolio, the data that's available for every one of our investments. And we don't have targets yet. We're just trying to get the total to see what the sectors are like, to see how we can apply it further on. But yeah, there's challenges.
So many challenges. What about you, Priya? What are some of the areas that Impact Engine is still grappling with, and how are you navigating through them?
Yeah, sure. So two lenses. So one, from our venture capital portfolio, we exclusively invest in companies where the impact is driven by the product. And so a lot of the KPIs are actually quite competitive intelligence. And so we are field builders. We're structured as a public benefit corporation, and we very much want to be leaders and share what we're doing so that people can compare apples to oranges and things like this, and they can report up and aggregate and put it on our website. But on the other hand, this is competitive to those companies, and so how do you balance, strike that balance between those two needs? So that's something we're struggling with there. On the private equity side, where we're seeding new funds, I'm finding it very interesting in terms of coming up or evaluating their own authenticity around impact. And I'll tell you, one of the key things that I've started to ask or to realize is, where in your budget does impact measurement fall? And you'd be shocked at how much of it comes from marketing. Then the next question, which is I think actually even more problematic, and it worries me a lot, is who's doing it. And it's really, really surprising to me, the trend I'm seeing in terms of people hiring outside people, not like a consultant to strategize with them, like actually to do it. And I kind of it reminds me, I've got young children, and my son lately has been trying to convince me that because I'm such a good reader, I should just keep reading to him, and he doesn't need to try to read. And I'm like, but then you're never going to learn how to read. And it's kind of like this too. If you are saying you are an impact investment team and you don't try to be impactful, you won't be impactful. And so I'm really grappling with, how do I be supportive and encouraging and build this ecosystem of people, of really talented investors who I know actually want to be impactful, but they're not willing to roll up their sleeves and I think do some of the hard work that's involved in actually making the impact happen. It's not just about reporting. And in many ways, I think if we like zoom out and we look at like the data and the glossy reports, it's actually adverse selection. The firms who are doing the least amount of impact probably have the best reports because it's coming out of their very large marketing budgets. So it's just like, I've been on investment committees and this and that, and I can tell you that, and we all can see it in all your, forward-looking statements, whatever, all this stuff, the return, the IRR is not guaranteed going forward. The people who really make the best decisions about where to put your money are thinking about how they made that money thus far. And no report is going to give you that. You're unfortunately going to have to roll up your sleeves, whether you're an advisor, whether you're an asset owner, whether you're a fund manager, or whether you're an entrepreneur. You're just going to have to do it. And so I'm trying to figure out how do I kind of teach and help and support that happen without discouraging and making people feel like, I can never launch an impact fund. I'm just going to go make money the old-fashioned way. So.
Thank you. So as you can tell, there's been some progress. There are some challenges. There's new challenges. Upon reflection, I think that it's nice to be in the new challenge space, and there will be even more challenges in the next decade. And so sort of in just wrapping up our part before we turn it over to you, I would love to sort of get everybody's point of view in one sentence or maybe two, around if we were to have this conversation in 10 years, if we were to be sitting here, what would success look like? What would have shifted? So I'm going to start with Tom.
I think we'd be successful in 10 years if the term impact measurement and management no longer exists and it's just considered part of good investment practice.
Great.
I'll also add that there's also a robust evidence base for the impact of impact investments.
Thank you. What about you, Priya? Yeah,
if every investor who wanted to manage all of their money in a way that was impactful, whether it's the trustee of an endowment or a second-gen inheritor of wealth, never had an advisor or CIO or investment committee dismiss it and tell them that it's going to lead to lower returns.
What about you, Anna-Amanda?
I was thinking much more narrow than that. That I think that in terms of impact measurement, we'll be measuring things that are much more refined because there will already be 50% women on the board, and everyone will know their greenhouse gas emissions.
100%
and there will
women.
be zero greenhouse gas emissions. So but we'll start to be looking at the, if we're still here, it's going to have to be there, right? And we'll be looking at details more like really who are we touching with this and how do we move that along rather than just getting these kind of baselines that should be there already.
Great. And Olivia?
Kind of to Tom's point, but actually kind of different at the same time. I like that this symposium is investing for impact. And I'd like all investors to realize that they all invest for impact and be forced to say, I invest for negative impact if they don't manage their impact. Managing impact is knowing what positive and negative stuff happens. Managing it is reducing the negative at the very least. Like 90% of investment is investing for negative impact. I'd like that to be our starting point of every conversation rather than like the 2% that are doing like incredible work, that a lot of them are in this room, because until we get that 90% to have to report the negative impact that they are managing, then this conversation isn't going to go mainstream, which is Tom's goal.
Perfect. Great. So turning it over to you, we provided lots of food for thought, probably raised more questions than provided answers, but looking to you to sort of give us a sense of what you want to know more about. So we're going to take 3 questions, and there's someone walking around with a microphone.
Hi, I'm Erin. I work at UNICEF USA. Hope we didn't give Anna Amanda a colossal headache. She's one of our investors. I've always conceptually thought about this idea of additionality. And apologies if I came to the panel late, so if it was already discussed, ignore this question. You kind of hit on it a little bit, Emma, when you talk about when you're thinking about greenhouse emissions and you say equity stake, oh, that's straightforward. We have a stake in the company. We can that's a proportion of which we can then communicate impact. But in a world of LPs and fund of funds and a lot of different money coming from different places going into one project or one thing, what are the types of ways you think about additionality, and is that important?
Great.
Hi, my name is Matilda. I work at Beyond Capital Fund. We're an impact investing fund that invests in seed stage social enterprises in India and East Africa, serving bottom of the pyramid consumers. So I was also out of the room for a little bit, so I apologize again. But I feel like we didn't really talk that much about the relative versus absolute aspect. And so what I mean by that is, the classic example to me is, so you're interested in sustainability and you decide to invest in a solar panel company, but the solar panels are made by children. Like, how do you differentiate between deep impact, comprehensive impact? Who are you to decide essentially, like, where you can set the limits? And so in terms of the relative versus absolute question, it's like, can we mandate impact investors to look at other variables? I mean, is it ethical to only invest in one specific type of impact if it's causing negative harm on another? So kind of a multifaceted question, but I'd love to hear your input on that.
Great. And one more question.
I'm actually going to jump on top of the additionality question as well and just say, when you're thinking about impact, the other piece that I think oftentimes is missed is causality. So you have these outcomes that are intended or unintended. How are you measuring those? And how are you guaranteeing that your investment actually had that additionality, causality connected to it? Because that's not necessarily true. It depends on the overall impact that the organization is trying to make. And it's possible that the investment that you're making actually isn't causing what you think it's causing.
So I love these questions, being an evaluator as well. Questions around additionality and attribution, contribution are fabulous to hear, particularly in this setting, but are very randomly discussed. So who wants to take the question? Olivia? No, we all have pieces of the puzzle, so we can start with Olivia. Go ahead.
Priya, do you want to go
Oh,
first?
I want to.
It's sad that I get excited about it. Probably the only person in the room wanting to talk about this. So I think actually I can touch on all those questions. I think I'm just going to start definitionally. So this is one of the longest conversations through the project that we tried to have a battle with, which is what do all of these terms mean? And more importantly, where's their place in impact management? So I'm just going to take attribution, which is the first point. I would actually say the way you described it and the way you described kind of dividing results by equity, that's attribution. That's attributing an effect to an investor. I would argue personally that does not aid impact management. Dividing a number by an injection of cash into a company doesn't necessarily help you say, is that good or bad, and does it need to improve, which is the impact management decision. It might be helpful for avoiding double counting for the large asset owners. I know a lot of DFIs want you to do that. But again, the DFIs should be saying to themselves, what does good look like? Are these companies reaching the boundary for good, rather than, can I make sure that if I add up all of my investments together, I don't get a double counted number? So attribution, I'm going to sort of take as dividing up, slightly put to the side. But you all actually touched on contribution, which is really important. And there are actually two aspects of that. Now, I'm going to call it contribution, not additionality, because this was a big debate we had in the project. Additionality is like, well, this is probably your field more than mine, which is a social science kind of counterfactual analysis. Realistically, we cannot ask every business to do a counterfactual for every effect they create. But what we should be doing, to your point over there, is thinking, well, what is the contribution that this business is making to what would have happened anyway? We can actually do that. That's just basic market analysis, right? That's just saying, what's my USP? Now, if it's a product or service, you'll be saying, well, I'm going to provide healthcare. And you can look across the dimensions. You can say, well, healthcare, okay, that's an outcome. Am I going to provide it at a greater scale, a greater depth of effect, or for more underserved people than what is already going to happen? Because it might be that if you then look at the market and say, well, actually, this person can already access that outcome at the same depth, cheaper, that's not a contribution. So that, again, is something that a business will likely look at anyway, and you can do that with other effects as well. But then there's a separate piece, which I think taps into the first bit, which is that you also have investor contribution. And that's another tricky one, because I don't think anybody's cracked the how do you quantify the investor contribution point. So what we got to in the project is that there are 4 different ways you can contribute. You can signal that you care about impact by saying, I'm going to measure. You can engage actively to try and improve impact management of the business. You can grow new or undersupplied capital markets by taking on additional risk, complexity, liquidity that someone might not. Or you can provide flexible concessionary capital, but only if it's not distorting the market, crucially. Now, even just saying as an investor which one of those 4 categories you intend to act in support of an enterprise is massively helpful to the market, because there's so many ways of talking about it. And then there are ways of then saying, well, this is what I hope the result of my engagement is going to be. So rather than saying I'm going to divide up my carbon emissions, I might say I'm going to improve all of the carbon emission reduction of all my companies by 10%. And that's going to be my engagement for impact. So there are different ways of thinking about all of those different points. I hope that's not going on too long. Sorry, Veronica.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Priya, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, the only thing I would add, I think that's great. I agree with all that. I think the other thing that I try to think of is really, to me, the way I define impact investing is it's investing with a thesis for social and financial value creation asymmetric to risk taken. And so what that requires in order to not just say that is to have a strategy. And so if you have a strategy, write down your strategy, you can try to figure out that causality. And I think that holds people accountable and also gives you a framework for what you do post-investment. But actually, the question around additionality and relative absolute, all these things, they're actually, I think what's really kind of rich about it is that we get the ESG world where I came out of and the impact investing world where I came to later, they're kind of like kissing cousins. Like there's some friction there. And I think there's like something going on, and it's actually funny because you're like, well, you're like in this for the same reason. And this is actually where they come together, which is if you have an investment thesis that's focused on one type of outcome, you can't ignore the rest of the business operations. And so all impact investing has to have an ESG framework as well. So we have an investment in a company that is doing phenomenal work around reducing recidivism rates through educating inmates using tech-enabled tools. And their B Corp score got dropped a gazillion points because they're not in a LEED certified building. And it's just kind of, part of it is should we not invest? Or are investors going to care? We also can't exit. We're an early stage venture investor. But the point is no, our thesis is around recidivism. And by not paying for the, Class A LEED certified building, in the loop, he's actually able to have more capital to go do what he's trying to do, which is reduce recidivism rates and roll out in new counties. And so the honest truth is there is no black and white business decision, and so it's really easy for people to point fingers. It's really easy for investors to point fingers at business. It's kind of let's all just get real. There are gray areas. And so you have to prioritize, you have to be transparent about what those goals are, and then all the other areas, there has to be a certain amount of trust, right? And I think that's where people's like intention and authenticity and like what do they personally have at stake here, and why did they start this business? Why are they running this business? Why are you investing? Like, if you can really understand that and there's deep alignment there with your investment thesis and that person's personal life, I think you can trust, or you should trust, that they're gonna make those decisions in the right way. But it may not always be perfect.
Thank you. It reminds me of the sort of one metric, one tool, one impact conversation and place we were. We're not in that place anymore, obviously, but turning over to Anne and Amanda. What are your thoughts?
I know, I really liked some of the things, Priya, that you were talking about. I would maybe disagree about the LEED certification. But I mean, it brings up a serious and interesting point, I think. And also, as a person who does count the total portfolio, I disagree with some of the things that you said. But the point is that my fear when I hear these kinds of questions is that it's an excuse for not making impact investing. And I think that's kind of what you were touching on, is that, look, we would all love to have great impact metrics from all of our investees and be able to say, this is perfection, isn't that lovely? It's not perfection, we're not there. And my feeling still with counting everything is you have to count them first before you can set a target. I can't tell the companies what the target should be before I know what they're generating and how that compares to the others. But I can sure as hell insist that they give me data and flag up where they stand in the other ones in our portfolio and say, you are currently the bottom of the pool. How does that make you feel? We're certainly not going to recommend you to other investors if you can't, because they're all going to get more investment. Or look for more investment anyway. So I think having a sensible framework, and I particularly liked in the IMP that 4 sections of where you place yourself in the market, because that's really helpful as an investor to think about my strategy, what it is that I want to achieve. But let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And let's be clear that we could always be doing better. We are always going to have to be doing better because everybody else is going to get to the level where we are, and we're going to want to demonstrate, and we're going to learn about new effects that we didn't know about. One of the things that I particularly am concerned about is that issue of, are your solar panels being made by starving children chained to a chair somewhere and wherever? And none of our impact investments look at that. They absolutely don't. They don't even look at the carbon emissions of shipping all their stuff over to Africa from China. No, I mean, that's not in the picture. And what we have started to try to do, I personally, I see you have a SDGs pin, I'm very conflicted over the SDGs because I don't find them I haven't found them helpful as an investor for positive impact. But what we've been looking at is, but they're obviously very motivating, and they're pretty, and that's important, right? And life is nice to have pretty things, and one of the things that I have found is that we're trying to do is to map the SDGs and the sectoral risks against our impact investments, so that the ESG element is brought in, because fundamentally, I can see using the SDGs as a risk management for impact investors. A lot of impact investing is still very fluffy, very feel-good, very pretty picture of a woman with a light on the cover of your glossy thing. And not to say that a woman isn't happy to have a light, right? If she didn't have a light, but that isn't the whole picture, and we need to understand better how we cover the downside as well.
Yes. Tom, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Can we
everyone's
ask
pretty
Tom
much
to-
covered it.
Can we ask-
But I guess just one quick thing on kind of the additionality point and thinking about attribution as well. I mean, there definitely are those impact investors who want to get to attribution, who want to think in terms of additionality. And I think that's fine. More power to those people who want to approach it that way. But I think what works for the market as a whole, for the 2,000 plus stakeholders that the Impact Management Project interviewed, is really more this discussion of your contribution and not having to go that far to get to attribution. It's not realistic from a resource standpoint to expect that people are going to do randomized control trials like Grameen for every single thing. I mean, that takes a lot of resources. So I would just caution around the attribution piece. And I think the other thing around this conversation around additionality, some people have tried to define impact investment in terms of additionality, and I would really push back on that, because as you think about the SDGs and just the sheer amount of capital that we need to be putting forward to try to address some of these societal challenges, if you're speaking in pure terms of additionality, you're essentially going to be not allowing for any public markets investments to be considered for impact. So I think it's inherently limiting to also what we would classify or consider as impact investments.
Great, thanks. We're going to do another round of questions.
Hi, I'm Sarah Hoyt from Cambridge Associates. Actually just got off the phone with a bunch of colleagues and was pushed by a colleague on a manager that we're looking at that says they're doing impact in the public space. And they said, well, if they don't buy it, then somebody else is going to buy it. So how do you define impact? Can you have impact, or is it just values aligned in the public space? And so I wondered if, from your last comment, if you could just expand on that a little bit.
There's another question right there.
So I want to ride on you guys' comment on SDG, because I personally find that the SDG framework is a little bit too macro or too global. So as an impact measurement professional or impact investor, how do you localize the themes of SDG? And also I think that impact investment can be highly contextual and highly dependent on the geographic location. So how do you, localize the SDG framework?
Great. One more question before we round up.
I'm a student at Johns Hopkins, and I want to ask that, according to IFC, the principle, the last principle talks about the regular independent verification. So I would like to hear more about what can be and should be the verification process. Thank you.
Great, and again, I love these questions as an evaluator. Most of the job is done by the really good questions and thinking that the industry is now asking itself, or at least this room is asking itself, so thank you. So who wants to take any part of that?
Those are good ones.
I'll start with the first question. I guess what I was implying on the additionality piece is exactly your point around if someone doesn't invest in a publicly traded company, someone else will. But in terms of strategies in the public markets that are impact strategies, they do exist, and the way that we see it come into play is more from kind of the investor contribution. In terms of, you can imagine with publicly traded companies, various fund managers actively engaging with those companies to try to improve various ESG practices or encouraging greater disclosure on different risks. I see that as really impactful in terms of moving the bar forward. I think there's also something to be said for more active management, maybe being more readily applicable to an impact conversation in terms of having a clear investment thesis around the impact goals you're striving towards and the types of companies that you're going to be selecting and weighting towards that could look very different from a benchmark. So we've seen a couple different strategies come forward that I'm sure you're familiar with, like the Bailey Gifford Positive Change Fund and others. But I do think there's room within the impact investing big tent for public market strategies.
Can I comment on that, actually? I think this comes down to the bespoke framework thing again, to be honest, because what's quite nice about us all communicating our impact goals and our investor contribution strategies in the same way is that actually we can call impact whatever we want to call impact, as long as we're being transparent. So the problem is I don't think we're ever all going to agree on what impact investing is. In fact, pretty much all of the 2,000 stakeholders of the Impact Management Project would put the boundary for what is impact investing in a different place on our matrix. What our matrix does is break it up into 3 different types of company: those that avoid harm, those that benefit stakeholders, and those that contribute to solutions. But then you've got people like UBS who feel really strongly that you have to be an engaged investor, supporting growth in underserved markets to be an impact investor. Now, some of you would wildly disagree with that because you might say, well, I'm in public markets, I can't be an engaged investor for one reason or another, but I'm still doing impact investing. I actually think it doesn't matter as long as we can have that conversation in the same terms and point to it really, really super clearly. And that way, BlackRock Impact can be BlackRock Impact if they actually place it properly on the matrix that everyone can figure out. That actually that's very different to an SDG fund, for example. And I want to comment on that one as well.
I can cover the independent verification. I understand, given the murkiness of this topic, that people think having an independent party verify impact or whatever makes sense. And I think that there are lots of parties who would like to be that. And there's people who are trying to do that or trying to point the finger to someone else to do it, whether it's auditors or consulting firms or ratings providers or whatever. And I'm just skeptical. I'll just say I question all that because I just think it's so high level. I don't think they really know what the hell's going on, and it actually increases the risk of there not being impact. So I actually think the fundamental thing, it's again, it just comes down to basics. tell me, and then show me. It's just very simple. Like if you're an advisor or an asset owner and you're evaluating a fund, tell me what you're doing and now show me. And the number of people who get kind of like uneasy about that, and they're like, well, it's like proprietary, and like, well, I'll just come to your office. Like you don't have to email it to me. We can just like show, let me see your like CRM database or like what is it? And the people who can show you, because it's actually part of their process, they're very happy to do it. And the same thing as a fund manager, I can say when you're evaluating companies, because this is the thing, like you didn't have this label before, and there are tons of entrepreneurs who have been building mission-driven businesses for a long time. But now that you have this label, some people use the label in order to attract impact capital. And so the same thing to them, like they can have this grand vision, and they are also equally, I think, there's equal suspicion here about impact washing at the company level. And so again, tell me, now show me. Like let's talk about like your customer acquisition model. Let's actually see this in practice in all the different dimensions of impact and ESG to actually verify it. And so again, like I just think this is true not just in the impact world, but the investment world in general. Like there's so many layers, and there's such a drive towards intermediation, and there's constantly a principal agent problem, and like the only way to like cut through all that in an era of disintermediation is for people to take ownership of their own assessment and not stand behind anybody.
No, I did, but she pretty much covered everything that I.
Okay. So Tom, you almost might have the final word, but could you talk a little bit about sort of what your thinking has been around, or your work has been around that validation verification thing?
Sure. I mean, I think we're currently thinking about the IFC's impact management principles. I think some of them speak to where the practice is currently today, and also maybe where IFC and others aspire for us to get to in terms of that independent verification. If you're thinking about financial data, obviously that's a big component of that. So frankly, we're not there yet in terms of our consulting work. We're dealing with self-reported data from various intermediaries or impacts, social enterprises, what have you. I'd like to get us to that point, but we're just not there. I think first we have to get clarity, and the Impact Management Project has been doing a fantastic job of getting clarity around the norms of how we should be conducting impact measurement and management practice. And kind of the next step now in this journey is figuring out now the right kind of core metrics as part of having that standard practice. And once we get all that down, then I think we can skip to, okay, how can we now verify this data? We first have to have the right data that's consistent and standardized enough for us to be able to have a coherent conversation.
I think for us as well, I was thinking it's for us a good 2 steps away. We're at the point where we're measuring. We got to get to the point where we're setting targets. And then beyond that, we'll start to really be verifying to see that the targets are met. But yeah.
Yeah, and then on the question
that's
around,
aspirational.
Yes, and on the question around the SDG platform and
Can I take that one?
Yeah.
So actually, I think that's a really great point about the SDGs, and I've struggled with them. I have a love-hate relationship with the SDGs. More love now because we've gone into partnership with UNDP, so I have to say that. But I think what's great about the SDGs, don't quote me on this, Chatham House, right? What's great about the SDGs is they're a series of commonly agreed really important outcomes. So one of the dimensions is what, which is what outcome. And it should be from the perspective of the person affected. Like, is it important to me, this in particular, which is always contextual information, which is often forgotten. I think especially by investors, it's like, I know that, financial inclusion is important to these people. Okay, but have you asked them? Like, what have they said that they want to buy with that money? And so I think that's quite helpful. But I think the contextualizing point is so key, because that's why they're not helpful if you take them out of context of which countries need which SDGs, and specifically around that who point, which I think we all feel quite strongly about on this panel, which is that actually the outcome is irrelevant if you don't make it relative to who. And the good news is that the UNDP has launched this initiative called SDG Impact, which is doing a market mapping with all their country offices to actually identify where the need is, particularly for investment, recognizing the fact that there might be better tools suited to tackle gender equality in Myanmar, and actually impact investing can be better spent elsewhere. So I think that conversation is starting to happen, which is great, and it'll also help investors be able to match their capital a little bit quicker, hopefully.
Yeah, and I would just say that, I feel like part of the way that we're having this conversation today is very much because of who's in the room. If you were to have a conversation around social enterprises, with social enterprises in the field, I think the contextual sort of conversation would be really relevant. And you're right, the SDG piece would be very macro, but I think that that goes back to sort of who you are, what type of talent you bring to the table, and how you're able to stitch that together so that sort of the value proposition for that social enterprise sort of rolls up to the various different investor levels, right? But it's actually very nuanced. And I think just going back and wrapping up, I think talent is really critical. And so as you can see, this stuff, and even 10 years later, and even though we've progressed, is not easy. It takes a level of expertise and experience that needs to come to the table. And you know, I'm very impressed with the fact that the kinds of questions, the types of answers are answerable today. They weren't answerable 10 years ago, right? And so, you know, just be really, really conscious of the fact of who you're sort of, to Priya's point, assigning to do your impact measurement and management. Really be responsible in terms of that decision, because if you were to get the right talent in sort of the space and the place, some of your questions and some of your sort of approaches would just be simplified. Right? There is that simplification piece. It's not an easy piece, but if you have the experience, as in the experience in this panel, as in the experience in the room, it could just get a little bit easier. So with that said, thanks for holding in.